I would like to introduce you today to Arthur Hessel. Art is a founding member of the firm Aluise, Hessel and O'Leary. And I probably should have said Hessel, Aluise and O'Leary.
Right.
Art retired from the firm in 2011. And while at the firm, he represented numerous clients whose real estate activities involve federal, state, and local government bodies, providing transactional services for these clients and representing them in direct communications with government officials on a variety of matters. During his practice, Art's work always centered on real estate law and on matters involving government assisted housing and development programs. Before becoming a practicing attorney, Art worked both for a local urban development agency in St. Louis, Missouri, and for the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. Art began practicing law in the Washington, D.C. area in 1972. Prior to founding Hessel, Aluise, and O'Leary, he was a partner at Kelly Dry and Warren, a New York-based law firm, and Lane and Edson. So, welcome, Art Hessel.
Well, thank you.
So, tell me a little bit more about the role that you have played in housing and community development.
Well, starting, I guess, at the end, the back end, when I practiced law, I practiced law for 40 years in Washington, as you said, Nan, for three different law firms. And in doing that, I represented a lot of folks who were housing developers, housing managers, housing lenders, housing agencies, and others involved generally in housing and urban development matters. I also was active with a number of trade associations. I was on the governing committee of the American Bar Association's Forum Committee on Government Assisted Housing and the National Leased Housing Association, as you know, Nan, and various others. And never in that period of time was I a principal in any of these organizations that I represented or entities. I was always the attorney trying to get my clients what they needed to get in order to do what they desired to do. Before that, when I worked at HUD, I had a really good experience. It was the late 60s and early 70s. It was the Romney administration. HUD was very active. It was filled with very interested and exciting people, many of whom went on to long careers in housing and urban development. And I had the opportunity to come in as a special assistant to two different assistant secretaries over a period of about 3 years, which gave me the opportunity to, uh, even though I was still in my late 20s, it gave me the opportunity to do a lot of things that most people in their late 20s would not be able to do in the federal government. Before that, I spent a little over a year, as you said. It was in St. Louis at the what was called the Land Clearance Authority, which was their urban renewal authority. And that gave me an opportunity to see how cities responded to various federal programs. And uh, both working for the city and then working for the federal government, I think gave me what I really needed to be able to represent clients in private practice.
Well, that helps. I'd like to talk a little bit more about your work at HUD. How long were you there?
Just under 3 years. It's about 2 years and some months.
And
Uh,
what kind of things did you actually work on? Do you remember some of it was an urban renewal type of
well, it's
policy or?
yeah. When I went there, there was a reorganization halfway through my term at HUD, so things changed a lot. But when I went there, it was the Assistant Secretary for Housing and Renewal Assistance, which was public housing and urban renewal. The man I went to work for is named Larry Cox, who had been the head of the public housing authority in Norfolk, Virginia. And what I did when I was there was primarily on the urban renewal side. And at that point in time, urban renewal was a big um, thrust of the federal government. This is when slums were being torn down, old areas with outmoded buildings, some housing without indoor plumbing and the like. And land was being cleared and then was being sold off for redevelopment in accordance with urban renewal plans that were developed by the city. And each of the urban renewal plans had to be approved, believe it or not, by the assistant secretaries, signed off, even though there were thousands of them that were done. So for a number of months, or maybe even a year or more, I was the last person who reviewed urban renewal plans before they were signed off by the assistant secretary. So that was one thing that I did. Also, because he also was involved with public housing, I did a lot of public housing troubleshooting. In other words, if there was a public housing project or a public housing program that was under some stress, I would be one of those who would be sent out in the field to visit projects, visit authorities. I remember spending time at Cabrini Green and Robert Taylor Homes. I think I saw every project in the state of in Southern California. I was able to uh, I was involved in the decision making when Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis was torn down. So I got involved in a lot of those activities as well. And the other area that I got involved with was relocation when the federal government was investing in a property or financing a property which was going to wind up with lower income residents being relocated somewhere else. How do you guarantee or try to guarantee that there's a place for them to go and that they can financially afford both the move and assistance in their new housing? And I was involved in drafting relocation policy for the federal government way back then. And then I did a lot of speaking around the country on relocation. I was sent to a number of places to do that. So those were, as I remember now, 45 years ago, the main things I worked on at HUD.
Really, that's pretty exciting for me
Mhm.
because back in probably 1968, I was in charge of an urban renewal project in South St. Paul, Minnesota. In fact, I've written about that on a blog on my website that you might be interested in.
Okay.
But we had to relocate all the residents of Concord Street back then. And you were probably the one that signed off on it. That's really
Oh, no,
exciting.
no, I didn't get to Washington until 69. So
Okay.
you escaped my review. But in 68, I was working in St. Louis, and I actually was put in charge of the development of one particular urban renewal plan, which was called LaSalle Park in the near south side of St. Louis, which was, I think, my biggest accomplishment in that job.
Well, being involved in Pruitt-Igoe was really big because tell us a little bit about the conditions that were there. You know, the problem, of course, is that we approved high rises for families, and that didn't work real well. So, talk about that a little.
Well, I'm not. I'm happy to, but I don't know that my voice is very knowledgeable. Um, in most of the world, high rises for families work very well. In New York City, until the coronavirus hit, they worked very well. It turned out in St. Louis and some other places they didn't. Pruitt-Igoe was built when another, as a result of another very large urban renewal project in St. Louis, where a lot of land was cleared, which had some terrible housing that maybe today it would be looked at as wonderful housing if renovated, but was really in terrible shape. It was housing from the 1860s, 1870s, brick row houses. And Pruitt-Igoe was developed as a relocation resource for families being displaced from there. And there were two separate projects, identical, separate but equal, one Pruitt, one Igoe, one for whites and one for blacks in St. Louis, which was a very, and still is, a somewhat segregated city. It was very segregated back then. And what happened, this has always intrigued me because it's one of those situations where good intentions sometimes lead to bad results. Pruitt and Igoe were both doing pretty well. And there was a film made a few years ago about Pruitt Igoe, which I recommend everybody try to see. And it gave the whole history in a terrific way. But at some point, it was determined that you couldn't have a white project next to a black project. You had to have one project, it had to be integrated, and Pruitt Igoe was integrated, and the whites began to move out in droves, as you would expect, especially in the 1950s and 60s. And pretty soon you had a project that was all African American, enormous numbers of kids. And I think the design of the project wasn't very good for families. It had not insufficient elevators. There were no bathrooms on the first floor where kids could go to the bathroom, so the elevators became the bathrooms too often. It had indoor playgrounds on every second floor as you rose, and those didn't work at all. And it had a number of very sparse amenities that weren't very helpful. And the project became very crime ridden and eventually was over time, they stopped leasing new units, people moved out, and then there was a decision which was very hard to make. It was when Pat Harris was the secretary of HUD, and the decision was made to dynamite it. And that is what happened. And the project vanished, thousands of units. And the people were relocated as best as could be. And the history of Pruitt Igoe was over in about 1970.
And I think we learned some lessons from that, don't you, Art?
Well, we learn a lot of lessons, but then we have to relearn them, and because we seem to make the same mistakes over and over again, which is I guess the human condition. But we did we learned, as we did in other projects in St. Louis and elsewhere, as you said before, that for whatever reason, maybe it's the nature of the families, the nature of society, the architecture of the structures. But for some reason, in most places in this country, you cannot put a lot of kids in a building and expect them to come out okay.
So, what about public policy? Have you kind of contrast public policy in those days versus public policy today? How is it made? What are the conditions, et cetera?
Or that I don't know that I have an answer to that at all. Or that requires a lot of thought. I don't know how public policy is made today, since I haven't been involved in anything for a decade almost. Back then, I, it's really hard to say because things were changing so rapidly. One of the big issues, and this goes again back to when I worked for the Land Clearance Authority, was the emergence of the idea that the people in a neighborhood had to be able to play a role in the development of their neighborhood, that you had to have tenant committees and resident committees that would have input. And that was viewed then as an extraordinary development that was going to help uh, define how cities were going to develop. I don't think it did any good at all. It just wound up. What I learned in St. Louis, not surprisingly, is that if you get 12 tenants together, you're going to get 12 different opinions on everything. And you're not going to be able to, unless you have a very strong leader who sometimes appears, that you're not going to be able to easily determine what you need to do. It sort of reminds me. I've been watching, especially now that we're locked down. I don't know how long we're going to be locked down because of the virus, but I've been watching a lot of these spy things on Homeland and various others, and they all tell the stories of these extraordinarily bright, smart, dedicated American intelligence agents, and everything they do makes more problems than the problem they tried to resolve. And I think in housing policy, for whatever reason, that often has been the case. I think back, if I can give an example, I think back to, again, this is when I was practicing law, my client was in St. Louis, so it's another St. Louis story. There was a project that was built in the Mill Creek Valley urban renewal area that was a townhouse project. um, I think it was a 221D3 BMIR project, if I recall. A couple of hundred units. They were townhouses. They were really attractive. They were different colors and different roof lines and different door styles. And there were streets that you could drive through. And in one corner there'd be a little grocery store, and another a little cafe, and another a place where folk singers would strum their guitars and sing every evening. And it was really remarkable. It was designed by a woman named Clothiel Smith, who was a well-known, I think, DC-based architect at the time, Clothiel Woodward Smith. And everybody wrote up what a great project this was. The residents were Black, and they were white, and they were Latino. And because it was near the St. Louis University campus, there were students, and everybody seemed to get along. And it was just a wonderful project. And everybody knew that until the federal government decided that the reason it was such a wonderful project is that the manager of the project, who became my client, was in violation of all the civil rights laws. He knew how many units he wanted to have white people in, and Black people, and students, and so forth. And he had this delicate balance. He thought he knew what the balance should be to keep the project stable, and to keep the project safe, and to keep the various tenant groups satisfied that they were living in a progressive, integrated community, which they were. And the fact was that he was in violation of every civil rights law you can imagine, because he had these strict quotas by race and by everything else. And so they said to him, "You can't do this anymore. You got to stop. You got to have one waiting list. That's the law," which it is. Well, he left the project shortly after that for various reasons. And the project, if you went to see it today, you wouldn't see it, because it totally disintegrated. It was then, within, I don't know, 10, 15 years, razed to the ground, if that's not an oxymoron. It was torn down. And this wonderful community lapsed. It was gone. And I know that there was a show on Fareed Zakaria on CNN, and he did a show last year on housing in Singapore. And Singapore has apparently no housing problems. They're all high rise. They are filled with people. Singapore is, of course, a very controlled place, but its population is very diverse. It's got Malays, it's got Chinese, it's got, Filipinos, it's got everybody. And in these apartments, there are strict controls as to how many of what kind of ethnicity can go into each building. And it works masterfully, apparently. And it just reminded me of this project back in St. Louis, which worked equally well until it ran afoul of the law. So what does public policy do? You try your best, but sometimes your best turns out to be your worst. So that's my example.
Interesting. So tell me a little bit about what you feel is a success story in your life.
Well, that one was not a success story. I will say that, and I also um, a lot of what I did. You said at the beginning that my work was transactional, and that uh, I also worked with people as they related to the various levels of government. All that's true. But I also did a lot of enforcement defense work. A lot of that when HUD decided that somebody was evil, that some client didn't deserve to participate anymore in additional projects, or they decided that the entity should be eliminated from its current roles in projects. There were all sorts of things like that. And so a lot of my practice, especially the last 10 years or so, was on that side rather than the transactional side. I got rather bored of the transactions, frankly. I really didn't care if A or B owned a particular housing project. I was more interested in resolving problems. So HUD, it's also sort of weird because most people I think who do what I did what I did, were left leaning politically. They were somewhere between the middle and not the radical left, but the progressive left in their politics, and were certainly people who were in favor of strong government and strong government programs as being necessary to stabilize society. But when you got into the point where you were representing a client against the government because the government is trying to enforce something, uh, it really raises in your mind whether your thinking is right or wrong in thinking that governmental policy should be as strong as you otherwise would think it would be. I thought that about half of the time that HUD decided to um, penalize or attempt to penalize a client from further participation, they were correct. And about half the time they were totally off base. And that ratio stayed very constant over 40 years. Uh, and when they were off base, you really couldn't convince them they were off base. And often you had to, if you had a client that was willing to compromise, that's one thing. But if you had a client that was willing to fight them, then you had a rather lengthy, difficult, and expensive task to do that. And I guess the things that I think of now that I was involved with, that I find my biggest successes was when I was able to preserve a client's ability to stay in business after being attacked. And there were clearly some times when I really didn't want to defend the clients that I was hired to defend because I thought they were wrong. But that was a minority at the time. There were I had one client who was being sued by the federal government for violating a number of things in federal court here. And his position was that as an owner of affordable housing, he had to meet minimum property standards that HUD had published. And that didn't mean that he had to do any better than that. So if HUD came out and said your project needs improvement, he would say, where can they point to in the minimum property standards that this property violates it? Because if it doesn't, They might tell me that I should cut the grass more often, but grass cutting's not a function of the minimum property standard. Well, that was pretty hard to defend, and I stopped defending him. But it was that was an unusual instance. Usually, I find that people who own, manage, develop affordable housing are really pretty public minded, public spirited. They're in this business. It's a hard business at every level. They're in this business because they think they can accomplish something. And HUD often views them as strictly in it for the money. And clearly, everybody likes to make a good living. And HUD has set up the Congress has set up these programs to enable people to become very rich, which is a whole other issue. But even those who are becoming very rich really want to have their housing to be something they can be proud of. They don't like arguing with tenants. They want their tenants happy. And HUD just sometimes doesn't believe that. They just think that these people are out to milk the system. And I found that very rarely the case.
All right, let's talk a little bit about your legacy. What do you feel is your legacy?
Well, my name is still on the law firm uh, 8 years after I'm gone. So I guess there's that legacy that the name is still known. I in my 40 years of practice, I tried to represent my clients as best I could with integrity. I don't think I ever was involved in anything that, looking back, I felt I should not have done. And I think that that kind of way to practice, which is not everybody's way to practice, although it's most people's, is a legacy because I trained a lot of lawyers. For a number of decades, probably 30 years, I would hire lawyers, I would train lawyers, I'd work with them, yeah, they all turned out pretty well. So I think that that's the legacy you have, is to keep going the profession that you're in through the next generation or generations.
What do you think is the future of affordable housing?
Yeah, it's really difficult to say because it's such a, you like to be able to say that you've accomplished something and now I can just take a deep breath and relax. But housing doesn't work that way. It's sometimes easier to build the housing than to maintain it. The issue of whether affordable housing should be large project based or totally scattered remains an issue. It's probably a question without an answer. Issues of gentrification obviously today play a big role in how you deal with people who are being priced out of the market, sometimes priced out of the city, certainly priced out of the neighborhoods where they live. I don't know if there's an answer to that. 30 years ago, that question was the opposite. It was the um, middle class were being pushed out of the cities as the poorer classes moved in. Then now it's the reverse of that. Um, there's just a lot of dynamics that change with the times and also with the demographics of a community. So I think it's just going to be a continual struggle. It is in every country. We've done a pretty decent job in most places of ridding ourselves of uh, terrible housing conditions that still exist in a lot of parts of the world. The best program we ever had was obviously, I think, the Section 8 program, because it was totally geared to the income and of the the families living in the housing, and was the most financially flexible that way. The other projects, the other programs often wound up with too narrow of a market. The tax credit programs are great if you want to help people who are lower middle class or middle class, but do very little without a Section 8 subsidy, obviously, for the people who really need the housing. And because housing is so expensive, it it we're never, or at least it's going to be a long time before we're in a governmental position to really finance what we need. So I think there's just going to be a lot of makeshift attempts to develop programs that will work for a time or in a place, and 5 years later maybe not working anymore. It's a very difficult area, I think, and I guess the other side of it is that the financing of projects have become, over the last 20 years or so, so complicated. You need to have so many different levels of financing, and with each level of financing, you have people who are making money providing it, and it just increases the cost of the housing. So most of the programs that are developed these days, I think, are much too expensive and complex, and we need to, throw them into the shower and let everything wash off them and start all over. I don't know. It's a complicated area. If it wasn't, you wouldn't have asked me that question because everybody would have known the answer.
Probably true. Art, one last question.
Sure.
What would you say to a younger person who wanted to be an attorney?
Any kind of attorney, or an attorney who is going to deal in this field, or
You can have your pick.
oh gee. Um, well, when I became an attorney, uh, one of the reasons I became an attorney is I didn't want to go to Vietnam, so I found a something I could do to keep me out of the military for a while. Um, that's not an issue now. The issue now, though, is that there are too many people who want to be attorneys, and there's a lot of people go to law school and then can't find jobs afterwards, and that's a big problem. But if you have the talent, and you really want to be an attorney, obviously become an attorney, but don't get trapped in thinking that that and I guess this goes back to a lot of people that I know. They get out of law school and they go work for the biggest firm that'll hire them, and say, well, I'm going to get great experience. And it turns out that sometimes that's not that good of experience, and they wind up having to figure out what to do later. So I think if you're going to become a lawyer, um, go in at the ground level where you can get some courtroom experience, where you can get some experience in a variety of fields, and then just let the time pass while you figure out exactly how you want your career to go forward. But I think I really enjoyed what I did. I had a great 40 years practicing, until it became a little like Groundhog Day, and I said that's enough.
Well, thank you so much, Art. It's
Okay,
been great to talk with you because you've
sure.
given a historical perspective from a different point of view. And I really appreciate that. I love talking about the history, of course, of things that were back in my day too. But it has been great to see it from a perspective of somebody who was directly involved in it. So thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. I look forward to listening to see how I sound. Thanks, Sam, very much.